War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with another week of World War III analysis as we await the Iranian strike. Their response to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh has not come yet. At this point, 2 weeks after the strike on Tehran, which occurred right after the inauguration of President Masoud Pezeshkian, we are, of course, also awaiting the Hezbollah response to the assassinations on their leaders, as well as their response to Haniyeh's assassination. Many tense moments now going on in the Middle East as we also watch these Qatari negotiations unfold. We're going to be hoping to see if that can result in some kind of ceasefire, but Hamas has said that they will not be attending. There's rumors that Iranian representatives may show up. So again, a lot of things up in the air right now. Journalists are reporting that there is potentially a nuclear strike that was threatened on Iran, and a former Iranian diplomat, said that the Iranian response would be proportional to that kind of strike. So again, we are hearing a lot of words about Iran's nuclear program, and we know how that relates to many prophecies that we've talked about. So we're going to be getting into all of that on the show. Before I hand it off to Dmitry, I want to make sure that you like the video. I know I don't ask people to do that as much at the beginning, but please do it. It helps us out a lot. Subscribe, worldwarnow.co, whether you're listening on Substack or YouTube. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, like. It really, really helps us out. So I want to thank all of our supporters and people that do that regularly. And if you want to support even more, you can, of course, get behind the paywall on worldwarnow.co. It supports a lot of the things we do here. So again, thank you so much. But we also are going to be talking about the Kursk war going on in Russia as the Ukrainians have gone for broke, taken over 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory, utilizing Western weapons from the U.S., all sorts of crazy things going on. There's, of course, escalations in Myanmar, rumors of coups that we're going to be addressing, of course, things going on in the Balkans, things going on in the Caucasus, things going on between Turkey and Greece, and updates within the church as the Ukrainians continue to persecute the Orthodox faithful. So with all of that in mind, we're going to dive right into this week's World War III analysis. Dmitry, how are you doing?
You know, the war is raging in certain parts of the world, whereas in the Middle East at the moment, at least between Iran and Israel, it appears, Conrad, that Iran has shown great constraint. I mean, Khamenei and Pezeshkian, we're not sure what is happening behind closed doors. It is very secretive, but the complete restraint they've shown over the last 2 weeks, they didn't wait, they waited 2 hours, 2 days, and then, of course, going into the third week here, we still have not seen a proper response to Haniyeh's assassination in their own capital city, which I think is promising in terms of Iran is keeping the ball in its court and essentially is going to be the decision maker as to when the response will be enacted upon Israel and when sort of justice will be carried out. And by justice, I mean, they could potentially take this to the United Nations or the ICJ. And I mean, perhaps I'm being hopeful because it does appear that the answer eventually will be extrajudicial, so to speak, and it'll come out in terms of a military response. Now, everybody's really waiting for it. Even the markets, I think, are responding fairly negatively. The last 2 weeks have been quite bad globally. The various economies around the world are essentially anticipating further escalation, and everything's been kept in this particular box of tension. Now, whilst all of this is happening, of course, we have incredible footage of Russian planes, as we mentioned last week, traveling across the Caspian, importing certain goods into Iran. Most likely, the Ilyushin planes, as we said last week, were bringing in anti-air defense missiles for Iran, and essentially to bolster its own defenses. And we also saw Russian Ilyushin planes landing in Lebanon as well, which the supposition is that this is potentially weaponry and equipment for Hezbollah, but again, that would indicate that Hezbollah and the main Lebanese government would need to cooperate so strongly that, in fact, they would open up their airports completely to bring in essentially Russian weapons and imports of this sort. But in fact, I think in order for Russia actually to openly cooperate with Hezbollah, as if Hezbollah is the actual state actor, Conrad, it would need to essentially almost admit that perhaps the entire country is in danger. Because frankly, if, say, the US and Israel form a complete blockade of Lebanon, we're going to see a similar situation to what's taking place in Gaza, a humanitarian aid crisis across the entire northern Levant, with basically the entire country of Lebanon becoming besieged, similar to the Gaza Strip. And in fact, geographically, they even appear very similar along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean. So perhaps the Russians are anticipating that, as well as possible strikes, as we mentioned as well, black swan events against their own bases in Syria, or perhaps accidents taking place. Very strong rhetoric from Erdogan is really keeping his strong anti-Ataturk, because if you recall, Ataturk was naturally a Thessaloniki Jew. Very strong anti-Ataturk, anti-Young Turks relation, very strong Islamic position on what is happening in the Middle East. But most importantly is not even what's taking place in Turkey and northern Iran, which we'll get to, but the actions taking place in the Hejaz, in the rich Arab nations, right? Because as we know, the Middle East composed of three primary massive ethnic groups: the Arabs, the Persians, Iranians, and the Turks. And it is the Arabs at the moment who primarily, allegedly, Qatar is the home base of the Hamas organization, strongly based in Gaza and Palestine. Yahya Sinwar, as well as some of the leadership of Hamas, may potentially be in Qatar this coming week. In fact, the anticipation is that in the next 2 days, Conrad, there will be peace talks between some very interesting parties in the country of Qatar. And these peace talks are not between Iran and Israel, which we mentioned earlier. So Iran and Israel, the stalemate that we see here, is completely, you can say, almost artificial. There are no documents signed, there are no verbal agreements traded. Iran is very much in this hot zone. And yes, Prime Minister Keir Starmer apparently called Pezeshkian and asked him to hold back, but Keir Starmer's opinion, based on the recent United Kingdom protests, are very much questionable. And I mean, we do know Keir Starmer's biased opinions, where exactly he's coming from, given his family and given his association with the other countries of the Middle East. It's very much a pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist position. So Iran understands this. They're not stupid. They understand that Keir Starmer is just trying to benefit Israel in the long term. And so in Qatar, the countries we have meeting are, of course, Egypt, who is probably the main spokesperson for the Palestinian people in Gaza, given that Egypt has been constructing something akin to a massive refugee camp in the Sinai Peninsula, which hasn't necessarily come into use yet, but they have been building it up for at least 6 to 8 months now. So in fact, perhaps that refugee camp will be ready soon to take in whomever Israel will maybe decide to move there. And, if they do go for this expulsion plan of Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip, which I think would be essentially equivalent and akin to some sort of cultural genocide of the Palestinian settlements in this alleged state of Israel. Now, the other two countries that will be involved besides Egypt is, of course, the United States, which I think will come in as the sort of good cop, and Israel, which will be the bad cop in this situation, essentially probably trying to convince Hamas and Qatar that there is really no way out besides peace talks. And of course, the host country itself, Qatar, it'll have some representatives, which I think will simply be there as essentially these political translators for the representatives of Hamas who will be present as well. But notice, Conrad, besides Israel, Iran will not be present, and Hamas officially will only make an appearance probably at the last minute, although we do know there are senior Hamas representatives, and even the late Haniyeh was actually living in Qatar for a long time. We do know that there are senior leaders of Hamas stationed in Qatar. Qatar is essentially their safe zone, their safe haven. And so the Emir of Qatar, I think, is open to essentially being one of these Islamic princes who resolves the conflict, probably one of the first, and I would say this is quite a commendable notion. But I believe it may fall on deaf ears, because this is very reminiscent, Conrad, of the Swiss peace talks, the peace summit that we saw a month or two ago between Zelensky and the other European NATO countries, in which Russia was simply not involved. And so it is very concerning as to how far these particular peace talks can go, with Iran not being a dominant factor, and also Hezbollah not being involved. And as we can see, Hezbollah and Israel are essentially raging a hot war right now, trading missiles, airstrikes, and other things in northern Israel.
Yeah, these peace talks are sort of the re-beginning of the talks that have kind of been put on hold ever since all sorts of escalations on the part of Israel. I mean, I couldn't even begin to describe which one specifically caused every side to no longer have faith in the negotiations, but some of the senior Hamas officials, this one being Sami Abu Zuri, he says, going to new negotiations allows the occupation to impose new conditions and employ the maze of negotiation to conduct more massacres, which, again, the fact that we still call the war in Russia-Ukraine a special military operation, despite it being probably more of a war than many things that have been called wars, while we call this genocide in Gaza a war, despite it really being nothing more than an indiscriminate bombing of an entire territory with a few militias on the ground happening to also wage a resistance. They don't have an air force. They don't have anything comparable to a similar military as Israel. So describing it as a war is a bit, that in and of itself is in Israel's favor. But you mentioned the, of course, increasing strikes from Hezbollah. It's not that Hezbollah has responded yet to the assassination and these other escalations against the axis of resistance, but in general, they have been slowly but surely turning up the heat ever since the response on Hezbollah from the supposed strike on the Druze village, which Hezbollah has accused of actually being an Israeli interceptor missile misfiring, while, of course, Israel accused it of being a Hezbollah missile, and Israel then, of course, assassinated multiple of the top Hezbollah leaders directly below Nasrallah. So they have been escalating and turning up the heat there, which has only led to many of the other members of Netanyahu's cabinet and hawks within the IDF transferring all of the equipment up to the northern border to prepare for this incursion into Lebanon, attempting to push Hezbollah past the river that, is within southern Lebanese territories. So very interesting developments there. I believe recently Yoav Gallant has called out Netanyahu, saying that he's actually never been in favor of the operation in the north and a number of other things. So there is major division between members of the cabinet, between the highest echelons of leadership within Israeli society, and Netanyahu has even put out rumors that he may be trying to get rid of Gallant, which I don't even know if that is politically possible based on the current political technology of the war cabinet. So hopefully Israel, as I said before in the past, I've suggested to the Iranians that they assassinate Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, which I think would really do a lot because, again, it's not taking out the top guy, but you would destroy his coalition and really send a strong message against, very militant Zionism. But I think one of the most important kind of lines of thinking in regards to this impending strike from Iran, or perhaps some are even saying there will be no strike, that Iran is literally just going to let this one ride, which I think would be setting a horrible precedent. Many people have said that if Iran doesn't do anything, Israel will realize, well, we can just do anything we want in Tehran, on their territory, to their people, anything like this. So I know they can't do nothing. Again, the fact that it has taken this long, and there's been rampant speculation from the Western media, Politico, CNN, the Wall Street Journal are always putting out new scoops about the supposed behind-the-scenes negotiations and the factionalism within Iran about this. And one of the most interesting pieces of speculation, this is from Channel 12 in Israel, which is anti-Likud. They say Iran is preparing to make only a limited response. Iran fears that a major attack could be a pretext for Israel and the U.S. to attack its nuclear program and essentially neutralize its nuclear deterrent, which we know directly correlates with Elder Theodore of Crete's prophecy about how you will be drinking your coffee and then you will hear that the Jews struck Persia's nuclear program, and then, real events will begin to precipitate, right? So very relevant sort of state of affairs right now regarding this impending strike, which, again, knowing how this show works, they will have already struck, and by the time you're listening to this edited recording, there will be all sorts of new news and developments that we aren't able to talk about. But hopefully not. Hopefully this is still fresh and good analysis, and the fact that we still don't know if the strike is even going to be just Iranian or a joint strike with Iran and the Axis of Resistance, if it's going to be perhaps Axis of Resistance strikes on U.S. bases and then Iranian strikes on Israel. Who knows how the Houthis are going to get involved in this? It's all very much up in the air right now. But the negotiations in Qatar are probably going to attempt to also broadcast a certain, at least, willingness from the U.S. to try to bring everybody back to the table for negotiations, to, in theory, encourage Pezeshkian to encourage the Iranians to not strike as hard as perhaps they may want to. But the speculation from Western media has been that the division is pretty much between the political wing in Iran and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and of course the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. And of course they say Pezeshkian and his faction, who again, he was already more of a reformist compared to the principalists like Raisi who had preceded him. It seems to be, at least the word on the street, that America is trying to perpetuate and lean into and perhaps put pressure on Pezeshkian because of this, is that Pezeshkian and the other elected officials in Iran are desperately trying to get a moderate response, to not kill a bunch of people, to not do major infrastructural damage or military damage to Israel, perhaps not to have the war expanded into Lebanon. They don't want that either. Meanwhile, those in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Supreme Leader himself want to really teach Israel a lesson and perhaps even disregard possible escalations and just do what they perceive needs to be done and accept that maybe a regional war really is coming. There have been reports that certain Iranian officials have said that their current calculus does not concern a regional war and that they will be responding what they perceive as appropriately regardless. There's other reports that have said that the exact opposite is happening and that they're waging not even responding at all, which again I think is a ridiculous proposition and maybe just wish casting by certain people in the Biden administration and the State Department that really don't want this to break out into a wider regional war before the November election in 2024. So I know that was a lot of analysis about this impending strike and the war and the negotiations. So Dimitri, I'm wondering, what do you think Iran is going to do? How will Hezbollah and the Axis of Resistance factor into this? And what will the reaction of the other relevant players on the international stage really be?
Yeah, it's curious because I heard a completely bizarre theory coming out of some Russian political scientists, and mind you, this is pure speculation, but essentially the theory was that Iran will actually not retaliate. And why? because they've already received what they wanted to essentially obtain from this Haniya assassination, which was that allegedly the US, so Israel apparently assassinated Haniya without any sort of US greenlighting it, and the Biden administration and the CIA actually elected to surrender certain Mossad cells which they had information about within Tehran itself and within Iran. And so a lot of Mossad agents were allegedly over the last week arrested in Iran, and at the moment Iran actually obtaining those assets is now satisfied that, well, perhaps this was the revenge that it actually sought. But again, this is just a pure theory, and it was based on the fact that Israel was very much acting in an unhinged fashion and not really listening to the leadership of the Biden administration, which really, frankly, what kind of leadership did they really provide here? I think Israel is the one of the leash. But nevertheless, even if this theory is completely false, I think it doesn't strike out the reality that because the Jewish community within Iran is so large, and these are local Persian Iranian Jews which go back to, probably even 550 BC during the Babylonian and even Assyrian captivities of the Israeli and Jewish people, right, and from the Old Testament. But these communities in Iran and on the southern Caspian coast, and of course going into Azerbaijan, they can be easily infiltrated by, of course, people of Israeli descent, and naturally that's probably how they can rise up within the sort of spycraft system within the Iranian state itself, and naturally get into key positions, perhaps even form these terroristic cells and act whenever they're called upon in 5-10 years or even several decades. So very long-term projects, which we know that Mossad is capable of, being such a ruthless organization. And so, look, I think Russia not being invited, Russia definitely has its hands full at the moment, as we'll talk about in a little bit as to what's happening in the SMO zone and even Russian territory, frankly. But we do know, of course, Abbas Mohammed traveling to meet Vladimir Putin. This is the elected president of Palestine. So Russia definitely looking at a two-state solution for a potential way to rectify this. Shoigu, 2 weeks ago traveling to Iran was a very strong signal as well that Russia, in a similar fashion to how you have foreign prime ministers and presidents traveling to Ukraine and to Kiev to show their support for the Zelensky regime, and various Hollywood actors as well. I'm not even going to mention the names of these bizarre, perverted people, but Shoigu and Russian officials being in Tehran, being in Iran, shows that Russia has solidarity behind this particular regime. It again scares Israel from even calling or even baiting an Iranian response. And again, as I said, it's completely up to Iran when it wants to strike on what type of targets. Could it aim for certain nuclear facilities that Israel has in the Negev desert and in the southern districts of Israel? Could it be, because again, the distance between Iran and Israel and the fact that Israel is such a small country, is just this very slight strip of land. Iran, frankly, can aim at any particular part of Israel and almost hit the target. So it definitely has the absolute opportunity to customize its approach to this particular retaliation strike. But we do at the same time, Conrad, we do see this almost peace-like approach from Russia speaking to Abbas Mohammed, and we do have even China, Beijing, calling for its support of Iran. So Xi Jinping, and if you really consider it, Iran is friendly relations with Pakistan, working to sort of fight ISIS-K. There's this strong consideration that perhaps the Chinese influence from the east, China is very heavily invested now in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and China, has and did push for the Iranian ascension into BRICS. Eventually, I think China's word will also stand very firmly on the grounds of peace, because as we know, China is not one of these massive military exports. It does want to build peaceful relations with nations, and also just tries to exploit the fact that it's this massive powerhouse economy selling manufactured goods all around the world, and wants to build this new Silk Road. And in order for the Silk Road to actually work, you do need one of the largest Middle Eastern countries to essentially be in a state of peace, which is frankly Iran. All these Silk Road projects that China has planned, this Belt and Road Initiative, they all involve Iran in some capacity. And so Iran actually, if it turns into a wasteland similar to Libya or Iraq, if there's these US ships, they are waiting there, burning up fuel, American taxpayer dollars, right, on standby for 2 weeks now, right, cruising, patrolling, essentially waiting for either Biden's call or for Netanyahu to make a potential signal. And China does need Iran to be whole and actually a capable player in this particular field, because it is China's gateway into the Middle East. China does need a more stable partner in this massive region rather than, say, Pakistan, who I think we can say that ever since 2011 and some of those Osama bin Laden assassinations, ISIS-K kind of re-emerging in Pakistani territory. Just the fact that a third of Pakistan is essentially uncontrolled territory, not in the same way as Lebanon and Hezbollah exist, where Hezbollah acts in the southern part of Lebanon and doesn't answer to the government government in the same way as all these various Islamist Wahhabi sects act in almost a third to a quarter of Pakistan and northern regions aligning to Afghanistan. These are like no man's lands. They have caves, territories where these terrorist groups are trained. And so does China really trust Pakistan, especially with this new corruption scandal of Imran Khan? I think it's very questionable on that particular angle. But Iran is a real powerful, it's an ancient civilization similar to China itself. And so I think the call for peace will be strongly coming from these East Asian states, which again probably have their own projects for any sort of special military operations in the South China Sea, the Philippines, and Taiwan. And so, rather than force a world war, I think China would prefer to have like a Hong Kong type scenario, a peaceful resolution to this entire conflict. Now, Iran is its own sovereign state actor. It gets to make its own decisions. And so I think it'll depend upon this new Pezeshkian government, as you said, internal decision making. Khomeini, I think, very much needs to, kind of restrain himself in order to not allow emotions to win over. Raisi was, a friend of his, and Raisi most likely was also assassinated by Mossad. I think now we can almost say this with certainty, although no evidence of it has come forward, but I think we can almost assertively say that all these provocations were committed by Israeli special forces, including this recent Haniyeh assassination. So again, a lot of pressure on Iran, almost as much pressure you can say as when the Ukrainians began again bombarding the Donbass and they forced Putin's hand in February of 2022 to enact the SMO. And so Iran has that same decision-making capacity on it right now, and that same onus of, well, do we act? Do we defend our brothers? Do we defend our own honor? Or do we allow Israel to get away with it?
I think that's some good analysis. I think as far as the Raisi death goes, I think all eyes are on Azerbaijan as far as my suspicions go. But you mentioned, Khamenei and his, need to show restraint with the Raisi thing. It's interesting how restrained that was ultimately as well, without even many accusations of foul play, considering that Raisi in many ways was speculated to potentially be the next supreme leader should Khamenei die or resign or however that works. They say that he was a potential candidate for that. So Iranian politics, very unique and interesting compared to the rest of the world. But the region is also experiencing some of the greatest expansion of U.S. deployments in the region in a very long time, and definitely since October 7th. And I'm reading an article outlining this. It says, on Friday, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin ordered the USS Abraham Lincoln Strike Group to replace the USS Theodore Roosevelt Strike Group, which is currently operating in the Gulf of Oman, according to a statement from Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh. In addition, destroyers and cruisers capable of ballistic missile defense will also be sent to the Middle East and the Mediterranean Sea. The statement does not say which warships have been sent, but 2 U.S. destroyers in the eastern Mediterranean took part in intercepting the barrage of strikes Iran launched against Israel in April. Austin also ordered the deployment of a fighter squadron to the region. The U.S. already has the USS Wasp amphibious assault vehicle ship in the region, which operates with the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit, capable of carrying out an evacuation of U.S. citizens in Lebanon should it be ordered. The United States global defense is dynamic, and the Department of Defense retains the capability to deploy on short notice to meet evolving national security threats. So the U.S. is moving some pretty serious hardware. We've got multiple aircraft carriers, multiple strike groups, major destroyers, all sorts of F-35s, F-22s. Troops being put on high alert all throughout the bases in Iraq and Syria. People on high alert in Jordan and Lebanon, the eastern Mediterranean, armed to the gills. And of course, the whole Cypriot situation with Cyprus also being prepared to conduct mass evacuations of U.S., French, and other civilians from this impending war zone here in the Levant. But the question then becomes, how much is the U.S. willing to defend Israel, and how much are they going to support a potential response from Israel, even if there is a perhaps even reserved retaliation from Iran, to the Haniyeh assassination. And again, John Kirby and Lloyd Austin and Biden and every other, political figure has made it very clear that they are willing to defend Israel in any case necessary, under any circumstances. So Iran knows this, and that's why I think they are taking so long to really formulate a threading of this needle where they can respond adequately while also not leading to the World War III that Israel wants to strike their nuclear capabilities. And ultimately, Nasrallah is probably the second most powerful person when it comes to these decisions, because Hezbollah has to do their own responses to all of this. I mean, of course, Hamas, being a more Sunni group, Hezbollah and Iran much closer together, but joining forces with the axis of resistance across sort of Muslim sectarian lines. Hezbollah also needs to respond to the assassination, as they are much more close to Palestine itself in the region that is about to be expanded into the war. And Nasrallah is also being pressured, I'm sure, to show restraint, probably by many of his Iranian sponsors that don't want his response to, in conjunction with the Iranian response, then lead to something that would cause Israel to escalate. I'm sure they want it to be coordinated, and even if they aren't joint in nature and happen at the exact same time, they are very much happening in conjunction and, with the other strikes in mind. So I think that is the calculus being played right now, and how they are talking to each other behind the scenes and some of the things that are perhaps being said. But at the end of the day, we really don't know. And the huge amounts of speculation from the West are definitely trying to present Iran as shaken up, as having no idea how to respond. And maybe they do have a good idea to respond, and we will all be somewhat surprised. But again, I'm also not holding my breath. You see the memes where it's like the Ayatollah looking back at you, like with the Trump, are you enjoying the movie? Refill your popcorn, you'll love this next part. It's like, are you enjoying the nothing happens? Refill your popcorn, you'll enjoy this next nothing burger. But, hopefully things start to get a little more interesting, because unfortunately, as much as I hate to say that, people are like, oh, do you want war? Maybe World War now is a prescription. I thought it was just descriptive of the time we live in. It's like, no, but as quote unquote nothing ever happens, the Jews keep genociding the people in Palestine, and the powers that be continue to orchestrate the war in Ukraine, and a myriad of other things continue to keep happening that are in nobody's interest except Zog and the evil people that run this world. So if things happening means that gets pushed back a little bit, even if it also means some violence in the other direction, then yeah, I think I'm ready for some things to start happening. But unless you have anything else to say about the situation in the Middle East, Dimitri, I know we have to talk about the Caucasus, and we've got to talk about some stuff in the Horn of Africa, but I think before we talk about those other multipolar fronts, it's time to talk about the situation in Kursk and in Russia and Ukraine, as major swaths of Russian territory continue to be occupied by Ukrainians. Civilians are being killed, and many people are being deployed now to this totally new front that was outside of the SMO zone until very recently. Our friend Gabriel Deroshin is there, helping people with aid, soldiers and civilians alike. So how about you give us a bit of an update on what's going on in Kursk, and how it potentially might expand to Belgorod, and what the Russian response is going to be?
Yeah, I don't want this to sound like we're giving you guys the pressing news, or if we're kind of overstating the particular situation, but it is incredibly serious. There's a reason why Vladimir Putin gave his 1.5 minute address, which was recorded to both the governors as well as even the people. The fact that it was recorded and put out online, and he had all the ministers sitting there at the desk with him, and he looked very upset. He looked, almost furious, and he was holding it in. He even had a notebook which he was reading from, so it wasn't even, he needed to choose his words very wisely and not particularly maybe say anything that he would regret later regarding this Kursk Oblast situation. So the Ukrainian incursion, which we spoke about last week, in fact was more than even what we predicted it would be. So in fact, when the 4 or 5 major villages were captured by Ukraine and they were pushed back from Sudzha, the town, or 4,000, 5,000 person town, not very large, but close to the Ukrainian border. Sudzha was in fact captured shortly thereafter. We actually made the recording, and the Ukraine has not just captured it, but essentially entirely surrounded it, pushed the Russian reserve forces back, and pushed back the Akhmat Spetsnaz National Guard, which there was so much interesting news, right? Because there was essentially 2 primary units. There was these stationed conscripts, Conrad. So these are people like, again, we mentioned 18 to 21-year-olds, very young, unexperienced. They did have drones which they could use for scouting across the Ukrainian border and sort of searching for enemy movements, but I'm not even sure they even knew how to use these drones properly. And so when the Ukrainians literally attacked with, and not 1,000 people like General Gerasimov told us, this is the commander-in-chief essentially of the Russian SMO zone, the main man in charge, Gerasimov was wrong. In the first few days of this Kursk incursion, Gerasimov stated that it was only roughly a few hundred to 1,000 Ukrainian men, but those were the wrong numbers. In fact, the reality was that Kursk was attacked with between 3,500 to 4,000 Ukrainian trained elite troops. And their attack strategy was very similar to the Ukrainian push in September-October into Izium. September-October 2022, if you recall, when large areas of the Donetsk Oblast were recaptured by Ukraine after the initial months of the SMO, when they would use these same strategies. They would get into these very fast-moving troop carriers, jeeps, and they would drive deep into surrounding, flanking Russian troop formations and villages. And upon sort of flanking these defensive positions, they would dismount and begin, of course, firing at the Russians from various angles, essentially from behind and from the rear, causing massive amounts of confusion. So what we see in the Kursk Oblast is essentially like if you imagine your hand and then the fingers spreading in all various directions, and the Ukrainians are driving 5-10 kilometers. They're not even holding any particular villages or zones besides the town of Sudzha itself, which I'll get to in a second. But the Ukrainians are driving, for example, west to the town of Snagast. They're facing the Russians there. Then they're quickly retreating, driving around it, harassing certain villages. Of course, all the civilians are completely demoralized and scared. There have been drones killing people. At least 14 Russian civilians have died due to drone activity at the moment. So these are just innocent non-combatants. Tens of conscripts who are actually positioned on the borders were captured by the Ukrainian forces, and it's a lot more than 40 or 30 that we mentioned last week. I believe it's most likely in the hundreds at this point, which is very unfortunate news. But again, one thing that the SMO's war has shown us, Conrad, is that battle experience, it literally amounts to almost everything, right? Even more than the simple, say, power of better equipment. It's just when you're combat experienced, you can literally have the entire Wagner column drive all the way up to Moscow and simply be unimpeded, and no one will be ready to stop you. And so this is exactly what we're seeing here. These Ukrainian elite troops, we're not even sure where they were moved from. Were they moved from the Donetsk front? Did Ukraine move them from Zaporozhye? They clearly are. There are some mercenaries involved too. There are, people could hear Polish, English. There are certain French mercenaries. Of course, these Ukrainians are wearing NATO uniforms, so some of them have American flags on them, which looks, I think, quite disappointing for all of our American listeners. Is literally people with American flags who aren't Americans killing civilians, terrorizing this particular zone. It's quite a bad look, I think, in general. And so to the left, they go to Snagast. To the east, the Ukrainians push past Sudzha into Borky, into Giri, and these are 15-20 kilometers deep into essentially Russian Kursk Oblast territory. And notice, as I'm describing this, and as they're moving in all directions around these various villages, there is almost no resistance. And the resistance only began to amount in the last 3 to 4 days. And so the Ukrainians, for about 3 days, had complete free reign in Kursk. Now, what's curious is this Akhmat National Guard Spetsnaz, which was led by General Apti Alaudinov, who, very famous, that's the Chechen general who was recently promoted to the head of the National Guard. He's an interesting character because he's allegedly on the front lines in Kursk himself, and he's stating openly that no Chechen prisoners were taken, and Akhmat is defending and destroying Ukrainian targets. In fact, the only real footage we have, and this has been claimed to be fake, is a bunch of Chechen prisoners actually captured. There is one footage of Chechen Akhmat battalion troops actually destroying a small group of Ukrainians who probably pushed too far in, but I'm just going to quote the Ukrainian oppositionary leader, and not really oppositionary leader, the former advisor to President Zelensky. He described this particular assault strategy that Ukraine is using as not the same one we saw in Mariupol or Bakhmut, where you have these big Banderite neo-Nazi characters. They're all tattooed up, and they're gonna get holed up in a particular fortress, and they're gonna hold off until the last moment, like a Helm's Deep, Lord of the Rings type strategy. He's describing this as more of like a Sviatoslav Cossack-esque raid, where the Ukrainians are not holding a particular zone, but in fact pushing out, terrorizing the countryside, and essentially as if on horseback, like in ancient forms of warfare in the past, they're pushing out and essentially surrounding and confusing the Russian troops. Now, as I said before, the only reason this is succeeding is because the Russians simply did not have a second line of defense at all. In fact, the entire Kursk Oblast was undefended, and these are tens of kilometers of just essentially roads, which there were no tank traps set up, there were no minefields. Big questions as to who, in fact, taking into account this SMO defense strategy, was in charge of these particular projects of actually defending the border here between Kursk and the Sumskaya Oblast, in which we knew there was Ukrainian. This is very close to the Belarusian border. This is very close to Ukrainian troop formations, and even it goes beyond simply not preparing a defense, Conrad. The other bad news was that these troop formations, these three, and now the number increases because today it's 14th of August. There was it's reported at least 5 to 6 brigades of Ukrainians are involved in this particular incursion, which increases the number up to 5, potentially in the 6,000 zone. So 6,000 elite Ukrainian troops were forming in the Sumskaya Oblast right near the Russian border, and there was no response to it. They allowed them to form, to collect themselves, to brief, to have plans, and then of course they executed the plan. And now Russia's in a very peculiar situation because a lot of territory is temporarily lost, and in fact these Ukrainians, it seems they have gained more territory than Russia has gained in the past few months combined. And so definitely this is quite beneficial. Notice that Zelensky was completely dead quiet for the first 3-4 days of this Kursk incursion. In fact, it seems that certain Russian commentators were saying that potentially Zelensky wasn't even involved, that this was Syrsky's pet project, that Syrsky, as well as some of the local Ukrainian commanders, the SBU, and perhaps the Ukrainian army, were the ones who planned this, even behind Zelensky's back, which will be interesting because that gives you this particular image of a Ukraine divided internally. Although the mercenaries are being involved in this does point to a potential NATO presence. Although, notice, no Biden commentary in the first few days, no Zelensky commentary. It does seem like this was kept very, very hush-hush. It's like even Russian spies could not get enough info on this particular attack taking place. So as it stands now, the Russian reservists are coming in. You have the Russian famous Pitnashka Brigade, which is 1,000-strong Russian experienced troops that were taking Avdiivka just a few months ago. You have even there's footage of Wagner arriving from Belarus, I believe, from the Belarusian bases. The Kursk Oblast is very closely positioned to Belarus. So we did at the same time have Lukashenko actually call his entire country to high alert and allegedly state that Ukrainian drones have been shot over Belarus, the Belarusian border as well. So everyone's really tensed up in this particular situation, and the fighting is only just beginning. Now, the key city of Sudzha, this is the main target, which at the moment, frankly, everybody has ignored. There's a few news stories, but the Russian media has ignored Sudzha, and I believe that's because they're trying not to give Ukraine any ideas. Now, why is Sudzha important, Conrad? Not because it has like 5,000 people and it's like less than your average even American suburb. It's quite a small town, but Sudzha has the largest gas metering station between Russia and Ukraine, which means that all the gas, close to a large portion of the gas that goes into Ukraine and Eastern Europe and Central Europe actually passes through Sudzha. And so it's the main gas station between Russia and Ukraine, and the pipes all go through this particular town. And so, in fact, now Ukraine has captured it. Sudzha is completely under Ukrainian control, although there is still a huge fog of war and the entire situation is not too clear, but we do know Sudzha is very firmly under Ukrainian control. And so now that Ukrainians have captured the gas metering station, there's this contention that comes up, and it's not just domestically important for Russia, but also it's a foreign political implication. If Ukraine decides to turn off this gas here at Sudzha, or at least blow it up, or something of that sort, you're going to have entire countries, a lot of which are actually Russia-aligned in Eastern and Central Europe, directly impacted. And these are countries which, frankly, are further and further increasing in, sort of their pro-Russian positions. And I mean primarily Austria, Slovakia, which is Robert Fico's country, who was the recent assassination attempt. His party, the Social Democracy, is, of course, leading in Slovakia. You have the Czech Republic affected. You have Austria, Hungary, and even all the way up to Croatia and northern Italy. This is where this particular the Sudzha gas pipeline will essentially affect all of these countries if the Ukrainians decide to do anything with it. Now, they haven't even made the threat yet, but I think Russians understand that if Ukrainians dig deep and if they begin controlling Sudzha and defending it as they've done with Avdiivka, Mariupol, and Bakhmut, will the Russians go to siege this particular town, given that it does have this important infrastructural target, not just for, the Ukraine sort of gas distribution, which Russia has been continuing to sell and transit gas through Ukraine for the entire SMO, which is, again, a questionable strategy, but also these Eastern European countries, because a war hasn't been announced. And so when you're going to have the AfD, say, Robert Fico's party, the SD, or even the FPO in Austria, the Freedom Party of Austria, when these countries will stop receiving, or even Dodik's party, they're going to come to Russia and ask, where is the gas? Where is this absence of energy that we've called for? And Russia they will not have a proper response. They'll simply claim it's a Ukrainian terroristic act, which is, this entire zone has been labeled a counter-terrorist operation zone, a KTO, similar to what Strelkov announced in the Donetsk People's Republic in 2014. So in this KTO zone, Russia will have no excuse and no way to explain to these Eastern Central European allies as to why the gas has stopped flowing. Now, this is all hypothetical. Ukraine hasn't threatened to turn off the gas, but it is a huge risk if these troops begin defending this particular town of Sudzha. It'll have major implications for Russian foreign policy in Europe, as well as even domestically as to what happens in Ukraine. A lot of people have not spoken about this yet, but Russian political scientists have begun paying attention to the Sudzha gas metering station, which is a very key target. The other, of course, key target, and this is still very much looking into the future, but we all know about the Kursk nuclear power plant, which is located about 20 kilometers deep into inland. Ukrainians have not really pushed that far in yet. They still have about 20 to 25 kilometers to go. But once they do get past that, say, 20-mile line, the Kursk nuclear power plant will be in danger. And so when that takes place, you're going to have a second Zaporozhye nuclear power plant situation. And at that time, you're going to have, international bodies, the UN, the EU, everyone will begin really panicking. And so I'm not sure if Ukraine will even have a direct sanction to even target the Kursk nuclear power plant, Conrad, because again, its European allies will simply ask Ukraine, okay, what are you guys doing? We haven't agreed to this. We haven't agreed to any nuclear threats. We don't want a Chernobyl 2.0. The Polish will begin panicking. They still remember Chernobyl very, very clearly. Nobody wants anything to take place in regards to like nuclear technology or nuclear sabotage. So it's a very hot situation. Now, in terms of Russian successes, Russians have began forming. The reserves have begun coming in, albeit quite late. The downside is that some of the roads in the Kursk Oblast are incredibly badly managed. There's a lot of potholes, so you have essentially Russian trucks driving over these massive potholes. I'm not sure why the Kursk governor and his entire cabinet is going to be brought into question as to how they've planned for this not SMO zone, but Ukraine bordering oblast to be so ill-prepared for such a potential incursion. It's just a really bad look locally for this government. And the other good thing I think that's worth mentioning is that when the Ukrainians do stop their armored vehicles, their tanks and some of these troop carriers, the Russians are very quick on positioning their Iskanders and their local ground-to-ground long-range missiles. These are similar to HIMARS, and taking them out. So we've seen a massive amount of Ukrainian armor destroyed. It's going into the tens, 20, 30, 40 vehicles already destroyed. So the Russians are hitting very, very accurately. And I mean, the Russian artillery strikes are almost on point, and they're taking out these key Ukrainian targets. As soon as they stop and they park their vehicles, the vehicles get destroyed minutes later. And these Iskander strikes, they can fly, these missiles can fly up to 500 kilometers in theory. So it's a very long-range strike that they're capable of. So the Russians are forming their positions at the moment. As soon as battle lines form in this Kursk Oblast, which they haven't even formed yet. This is still very much a free-for-all, random type of attack, and the Ukrainians not holding any particular positions except Sudzha at the moment. And so as soon as clear battle lines formed, then Russians can begin plowing away at the targets which they see, at battle lines which they used to, and when lines are drawn very clearly, then they can begin pushing the Ukrainians back in an orderly fashion. But at the moment, it is incredibly chaotic and, again, very, very inappropriate. And I think Putin was correctly upset at Ukraine for one, lying about these peace agreements, right? This is clear Zelensky either knew about this incursion or simply did not know and could not control his Ukrainian army, which is why Putin specifically called this a provocation of the Ukrainian armed forces. He didn't say it was a provocation of Ukraine. He said it was a provocation of the armed forces. The question is, how can armed forces provoke anything outside of the green light from Kiev? But nevertheless, any peace agreements between Ukraine and Russia, I think, besides the fact that unless Ukraine wishes to use this Kursk Oblast occupied zone as a certain bargaining chip, I think are clearly out the window at this point. So it's funny how we have in Palestine a potential growing peace agreement in the next few days, whilst in Russia, Ukraine, any signs of peace are put indefinitely on hold while this terroristic incursion is taking place in the Kursk Oblast.
Yeah, it's funny how we've gone back and forth on which conflict we think was most likely to get wrapped up sooner. For a while, we definitely thought it was Russia-Ukraine, and now it's looking like that's not true, regardless of how the situation in the Middle East goes, whether peace talks are successful or bombs start flying. Either consequence seems like it's more on the horizon than anything close to an end to the bloody long front line that is Russia-Ukraine. But you mentioned the situation, of course, in Kursk being the highlight right now, but Zaporozhye is also still a hotbed of action. Recently, the cooling facilities for the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant caught on fire, as well as, that included one of the literal big smokestack towers, the iconic nuclear smokestacks you see at any nuclear power station. Those were struck by something and on fire. And again, both sides claim to not know exactly what happened. It seemed pretty clear to me that it was some kind of Ukrainian misfire based on the direction that it was coming from and some other analysis, but everybody is trying to blame the other person and get international authorities involved and use that as a pretext to do this, that, or the other in the region. But Syrskyi and the other authorities in the Ukrainian military claim that a big Zaporozhye push is still in the works and that the Kursk incursion affects it in no way, which obviously is total nonsense. They don't have enough people to be doing these kinds of things that don't affect the other fronts of the war. But of course, you mentioned Lukashenko getting the Belarusian armed forces on high alert and moving air defense and preparing. I don't believe that Belarus is going to be getting involved in Ukraine anytime soon, but they're definitely prepared to perhaps assist Russia, as we know that even at the very beginning of the SMO, the Belarusian military hospitals and medics were used by, the SMO forces that were initially surrounding Kiev and trying to force the quick surrender that we know never actually came. But unless you have anything else you want to say specifically about the front line and the SMO, we do briefly want to mention the new news about the Balt Connector gas pipeline that we reported on almost a year ago, back in October, that connected Finland and the Baltic states. The rumor that we reported and believed was that it was a Chinese dredging ship that had dragged its anchor across the seabed to destroy this gas pipeline. I guess perhaps the Russians had asked them to do this to sort of flex and show that they can do those sorts of things too in the aftermath of the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. But it's basically been completely confirmed that this was the Chinese, and it appears that there's pretty much going to be no consequences. So we're definitely escalating World War III in terms of the provocations that both sides are now able to get away with, because on either side it is perceived that the other side has so dramatically overstepped that we just need to start taking these actions, or else there will be no deterrent. It's very similar to the Iran situation, how it doesn't matter how many people in Iran would be willing to take the assassination of Hania on the chin. Remember, he's not Iranian. Some Iranians may even view the Hamas resistance as a pain in their side, as they are trying to develop to perhaps take on and challenge Israel and the United States at a future day where they have better relationships with Russia and China and have a better infrastructure. But, despite all of that, they still need to show that they're not going to accept that and aren't going to allow Israel to further do other strikes that would, of course, include Iranian officials. We know that the Soleimani strike is still having issues today. Who knows if the axis of resistance would have been better managed and some of these responses would have been better, and the Palestinian genocide perhaps could have been curbed even more if Soleimani was actually still in power and leading the axis of resistance, which ultimately he is the founding father of. He is the one that put all of the pieces together and united all of these Shia groups to confront Israel. So it all is very interesting, and we know that Iran has brain drain, and it's clear even with the Raisi death that even if it wasn't an assassination, that there's some serious issues going on internally regarding infiltration, as well as just certain levels of incompetence. So all of this, does tie together with the Russian stuff, because they're in the same boat. They are always playing this game with responses and how far they can go, because at the end of the day, nobody can truly stand up to the United States Navy at this point, with its aircraft carriers and jets and ability to project power at any corner of the world within mere hours. So we're all waiting for perhaps the economic collapse to come that will really do that big Leviathan in finally, to allow multipolarity to be able to challenge it on the military battlefield, which is when things are going to start to get really, really interesting. But the situation, of course, in the Caucasus is also still moving in very different directions with each country now. Georgia, of course, moving towards the Russian side. Azerbaijan maintaining its relationships with Israel, despite Turkey really, really ramping up the rhetoric against Israel. But regarding the Turkish situation with Armenia, Azerbaijan, we talked about last week that the Zangezur corridor is off the table, so there isn't going to be that true Turkish belt. But at the same time, Turkey, despite implying that it was going to be reproaching with Assad and welcoming Assad to Ankara, they're saying that before anything like that can happen, there needs to be a new constitution and all sorts of other crazy things that I don't know how soon Assad is interested in getting around to those sorts of things at the behest of the Turks, who, again, are still operating very strongly in Iraq and in parts of Syria, while the Syrian Arab Army conducts more and more military exercises against the equivalent of, the previous rebels and all of those that were funded by all sorts of powers around the world. But I think probably the other big developing front right now that relates to all of these factions, specifically Turkey and Russia, is the developing situation in Libya, as I know we haven't heard much about that recently. Even at the beginning of World War Now, when we started back 2 years ago, it was much more of a dormant front, despite the fact that Libya is still basically a failed state with 3 different governmental entities operating, very much similar to the Yemen situation. They're probably the 2 most analogous situations as far as the borders and the distribution of the factions go. But the Libyan National Army, led by Haftar, who is by many viewed as the successor to Gaddafi. Others might dispute that, but he is, of course, Haftar is, of course, supported by the Russians, and in many ways is now aligned with all of the African states in the Sahel region that have used Wagner forces and aligned themselves with Russia to secure coups and break themselves free of more French and American influence. So the rumor now is that Haftar is gathering his forces on the border with the Libyan government that operates out of Tripoli, that is recognized by the United States and more of the Western world, and that they are amassing troops with Wagner troops present and prepared to perhaps attack and then unite and connect with a huge connected belt for trade and military collaboration with Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and these other countries that are forming the Confederation of Sahel states with the help of Russia and China and, the BRICS alliances. So this is all extremely interesting. We know that this is where the Turks have really clashed with the Russians, because the Turks support the pro-Western government in Tripoli that would also allow more Turkish dominance of that part of the Mediterranean, really giving Turkey a much more dominant position. And they already are pretty much the most dominant state immediately in the Eastern Mediterranean. And this, influence over into Turkey, into the Central Mediterranean would be very good for them. So this is one of those ways where the Russia-Turkey clash begins to become more and more clear, and how that could exactly manifest. And I know Libya has been, many people say that the whole Gaddafi-Libya thing is when World War III really began, and then leading directly into the Syria conflict. And that's 2011, 2014. We know exactly where we've come since then, a decade later. So it all comes together.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we do see U.S. diplomats actually arriving in Tunisia, which is right next door to Libya, just in the west there. And we do have to kind of acknowledge the fact that U.S. does want to have a presence in terms of NATO, and, doesn't want to allow the Turks to have free reign as they have on the Horn of Africa in Somalia, to sort of control the flow of information, and potentially even, we have to not leave this out, but the U.S. does need a base for its certain ISIS handlers in North Africa. Potentially Tunisia is that base, which is why at the moment Tunisia is stating that it will be the spokesperson for Libyan security. Now, what relation that has to, say, Khalifa Haftar and his rising project of, free, lawful Libya, which again rises up after the destruction of 2011. We're not too sure, but it definitely doesn't fall into the plans of the United States. To have Libya connect to these other so-called renegade Sahel states, I think this is a project which will greatly disrupt any potential for France and these other countries for some of the spreading of globalism in this region. Now, the reason I want to mention that is because Niger, actually, which has had its coup earlier this year, has finally announced that it will completely stop exporting uranium to France. And France has in turn announced, and Emmanuel Macron, of course, personally announced, that France will prevent any further humanitarian aid or any aid of any sort going to Niger, as the regime is deemed to be unfriendly and is acting outside of the law. And so now at the moment these relations are broken, and I think moving forward, this is probably the correct position to take. France will most likely be pressured by this lack of uranium exports, which I think we'll cover on an upcoming A4Hour episode where we discuss France, its relation to uranium exports from various countries, and its dependence on energy. This loss of Niger to France, Conrad, is equivalent to, I would say, the Nord Stream pipeline, the Nord Stream 1, and I guess Nord Stream 2 as well, not happening and not actually supplying gas from Russia to Germany, in terms of how big of a crisis it will form later on, as the French economy, essentially, while the entire world goes into this massive recession and the fiat system collapses, France will be one of those countries that suffers enormously from this lack of very cheap and sustainable energy coming out of Northwest Africa and these sort of raw uranium fuels. It's just very unfortunate for the NATO countries, but in fact they should have chosen their allies better and behaved in a much more considerate fashion, rather than simply imposing regime change across all these African nations. And the Africans respond with their own Maidans, with their own internal coups, and frankly this is just the way regime change actually takes place in these countries, because there's no way to vote yourself out of a Maidan type situation, as Ukraine has shown. Once Zelensky got into power, once Poroshenko has taken rule, anybody who opposed them would be either assassinated or deemed to be an enemy of the state, and the liberal globalist regime would again push its agenda onto the client host people upon which they're parasitically attached to. And so this is the same thing we see in Africa. So this is why these coups in Burkina Faso and Niger actually succeed, and this is why I think Haftar in Libya, and him having this strong militaristic background as well, similar to Gaddafi in his early days, I think that's less of a negative factor. It's not like, okay, right, here we have another warlike general who wants to impose his rule over a certain people. I think it's more of a advocacy for peace in the long term in the region, because there's simply no way you can be a political leader and not have any ties to the military in these states, because the way the enemy acts is through militaristic means. They claim to have this global monopoly on violence, and being this world police officer while at the same time funding various terrorist groups. So unfortunately, that's the reality taking place in Africa at the moment. In a way, it's a very similar situation to, just as Wagner and Russia is involved in Africa and Northwest Africa, as well as Libya, we do see a similar involvement, for example, with China in Myanmar, where they support a very strong militaristic government in order to secure the region rather than allow it to essentially drop off into this state of lawlessness as we see in Myanmar. I think that's a very interesting analogy we can make, but except that Myanmar is in fact in a much hotter zone. It's essentially 2011 Libya taking place in that country right now in Southeast Asia.
I think that's a very important parallel to make quickly before we get into the details going on in Myanmar. I want to talk about how Andrei Belousov, of course, the defense minister of Russia, he met with in Russia the defense ministers of Burkina Faso and the director of the Department of External Relations and Military Cooperation for Niger. And they talked about all sorts of Russian cooperation, military security of Central Africa, as well as relationships with other African states, ECOWAS, and these sorts of things. And I think Haftar sees this as a budding opportunity to, get on board with the group of other African leaders that have some level of popular support that border his country, and then basically, be safe from the chaos that has racked Libya for so long and begin to stabilize it and maybe be a new Muammar Gaddafi, who, again, we know brought Libya from being one of the poorest countries in Africa to having probably, I believe, the highest standard of living on the entire continent. But speaking of other African issues, the negotiations in Ankara between Turkey, Somalia, and Ethiopia are continuing. Apparently, they are going late into the night, 12 hours at a time. And the word is that Turkey has reopened its offer and basically forced Somalia to concede that it will give Ethiopia access to the sea if Ethiopia stops recognizing Somaliland and Puntland independence. I didn't see any particular responses from Ethiopia because Somalia has totally walked that back in the past, so I don't know why they would trust them per se, but those are very much continuing and will have a dramatic effect on the future politics of the Red Sea and politics with Russian relations in that region, because Russia, I think, is very conflicted on who to side with because they have flip-flopped from supporting the Rapid Support Forces, for example, to the Sudanese government in the civil war in Sudan, and the RSF have killed hundreds and hundreds of people and continue to take territory and get closer and closer to potentially taking the capital. But the current Sudanese leadership has made all sorts of promises to Russia, I think more than the Rapid Support Forces even did. So Russia, I believe, has withdrawn some of its support for the RSF, so perhaps we will see them beginning to falter even more in the region. But quickly, you have an update on the negotiations, of course, going on in Qatar, all of these negotiations between all these different powers going on at once. It's very much a year of international diplomacy, but the word is that, of course, the Hamas leadership will demand that there will be no compromise on Israeli troops in Rafah or at the Philadelphia crossing, so sort of leaning on Egypt. I believe that is them attempting to get the Egyptian negotiators on their side, because that was a red line for Egypt, supposedly, that they just totally let happen, that the Israelis were not allowed to access the Philadelphia corridor or the Rafah crossing into Egypt from Gaza. So that's something that they're leaning on. But again, we still don't know if there will even be Hamas representatives at the Qatar negotiations to begin with, or if there will be even Iranian representatives in their place, which some speculated, of course, would happen. But you spoke of Myanmar. The rumors over the weekend were that there was an internal coup in Myanmar. The reports that ultimately the junta said were untrue. We don't have full confirmation, but they said that Min Aung Hlaing, the leader of the Tatmadaw junta, was allegedly detained by the lieutenant general of the junta, Aung Ling Dwe, but this is all very disputed at this point, very up in the air. The junta is not super public. That's kind of how juntas work. They aren't politicians with media appearances. It's all military generals and figures playing, very dangerous politics because people get killed and assassinated, and there's court-martials involved in everything. But the resistance and the democratic ZOG forces that are currently winning the civil war, of course, recently taking cities like Lashia with over 130,000 people, capturing all sorts of Tatmadaw forces. They said that this coup does not have any effect on the resistance, and that if it is real and the news is confirmed, it is most likely a reactionary, anti-revolutionary coup that would, cement the more what the liberals believe as the more negative aspects of the junta, that the coup would reinforce those. So some very interesting things going on in Myanmar. Of course, next door, Bangladesh, the political fallout continues, that the leader who fled to India has, called on there to be peace. The rumors continue about Muslim massacres of Hindus, and then there's rumors of in India, Hindu reprisals and pogroms on Muslims and everything. So, of course, Israel probably has its hand in there, with India being such a strong supporter in the face of the Muslim dialectic that's been created there. So, very much a real multipolar situation going on in the subcontinent and in Southeast Asia, all while China continues to encroach upon, Philippines and Vietnam even, and these other neighbors to its south, while the Taiwan question continues to loom, and every day dozens and dozens of Chinese planes and boats quote-unquote violate Taiwan's airspace and whatnot. So the world of the South Pacific, the world of Africa, South America, Europe, it's all very much World War now. So the show is vindicated, even though things are beginning to get a little bit scary, because even the media, I think, is going to have to start admitting, like, look, this is effectively the equivalent of the Third World War. I was talking about this with someone at my parish, is the only reason there isn't panic and, rationing like there was during the Second World War is because the media establishment and the militaries and the industrial complexes that kind of control everything around the world haven't come out and said that, yes, this is the Third World War, even though all the ingredients are very much already there.
Yeah, it's curious how you do have these states around the world which have essentially internal divisions, typically amongst religious lines. We see the same in, of course, Kosovo and Serbia, where, recent news, Conrad, have been that in the Kosovo city of Mitrovica, the leader of Kosovo, Kurti, has mentioned that. So the city essentially, and sounds very medieval, but the city is divided very clearly by a highway and other primary buildings, and essentially you have this bridge. The Mitrovica bridge essentially has been closed for several years now, and Kurti has recently stated that the time of peace has come and this bridge needs to be opened up in order to connect, say, the Serbian and the Albanian sides of the city to encourage sort of local intermingling. Now, what's funny is Western commentators have, in fact, actually spoken up and they stated that Kurti is wrong. This is probably going to increase more ethnic tensions between the Serbs and Kosovar Albanians. And so, both these people are, of course, so-called citizens of Kosovo. I'll say so-called because Kosovo is very much an unrecognized type state, even, I would say, a lot less legitimacy than Palestine or some of these other formations. Is probably more akin to, say, a Kurdistan. And you do have these concerns in this particular city that potentially, as soon as, what we've seen over the last year is, as soon as further tensions arise between the Serbian and the Albanian people in Kosovo, and typically, just as in Bangladesh, where you have a dominance of the Muslim population, and as soon as oppression of the minority Hindus commences, you do need the neighboring countries, such as India, to step in and essentially either encourage peace via diplomacy or via, direct sort of threat of sort of policing violence, which is, I think, what the Republic of Serbia actually provides to Kosovo, is this threat of, a peacekeeping operation taking place, and which is why the Muslims of Kosovo need to keep their hands off of the local Serb minorities. And I think that's the particular threat that we have here in Kosovo sort of forming. And this is a particular front which has always been on the edge for a little while, and it seems that, we don't really have hopes or positive things to say about the leader of Kosovo, Kurti, because he's been making very Zionist type statements over the last few months and even year. He's been, of course, pro-Zelensky, he's been pro-Netanyahu, he's taken essentially the wrong positions on almost every foreign political stance around the world, despite the fact that his country is in fact predominantly Muslim. And by country, I mean Kosovo, essentially a lawless territory, right, you can say. But still, it's something that Vučić will need to take into account. And so all eyes will be on this potential opening of the bridge, which is the sort of flashpoint in the city of Mitrovica in Kosovo, incredibly concerning. And, potentially, as you said, just as in Bangladesh or Myanmar, wherever you have these small minorities intermingled and interrelated, and there's no clear division between them, and it's essentially two diasporas and sort of two communities living side by side, there's always a potential that provocation could lead to armed clashes, and this could escalate further. I mean, we saw that in Ukraine as well, frankly, between essentially the Russians and the Ukrainianized Russians and the followers of Bandera.
No, and this is really just Kurti trying to garner more support from his, Albanian nationalist base, because ultimately Vučić has conceded a lot of lithium mining rights to the United States. They also recently sent weapons to Ukraine, even if it was more symbolic just to get Zog off their back about it. It is clear that Vučić seems to be doing the minimum he needs to do to get the U.S. off his back, to not assassinate him or coup him out, because look, they tried to kill Trump, they shot Robert Fico. There were comments recently in some speeches from all sorts of Serbian characters that they're going to kill anybody that doesn't support Ukraine. So Vučić has been appeasing the EU and the powers that be, and I think Kurti is probably not going to get what he wants with this bridge, because, the powers that be in K4 and in the U.S. mission to Kosovo are very hesitant, and he, of course, pushed things too far recently. In the past, we talked about how Rick Grenell and even these other globalist figures were slapping him down because he was getting too greedy and thinking he could push them too far and persecute the Serbs too hard, pretty much. But Yeah, the whole region there is interesting. Dodik, of course, is continuing to do his thing in Republika Srpska, and we are very much supporting it. But other things going on in the Balkans, of course, we have the huge wildfires in Attica. Greece is being raged by their yearly fires, but this year it's even worse, unfortunately. It appears that over 100,000 acres of land at this point, monasteries have had to be evacuated, homes have had to be evacuated at this point. France, Italy, the Czech Republic, Spain have all been sending all sorts of firefighting planes and personnel and all sorts of other people to fight these fires. And there are a number of prophecies, I don't have any of them with me right now, that I do believe mention the fires and burning of Greece becoming a real relevant thing in the lead up to World War III. So perhaps when I go to Greece, I'll talk about all of that. But I think that's a good time for me to briefly mention before we talk about some of our final stories. We've got some church news and a few other things, but you're not going to be hearing from me on World War Now for a few weeks because I am headed to Cyprus, Mount Athos, and Greece. I am going to hopefully be meeting and interviewing Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphou. I will be likely staying with Metropolitan Tychikos of Paphos, who we've mentioned on the show before, when I am in Cyprus. And then after that, after a brief trip to Thessaloniki, I will be going to Mount Athos for, I believe, 8 days or something similar to that, visiting many monasteries, being there for the Feast of the Dormition, which is kind of the great feast of the Holy Mountain, as their patron over the entire peninsula is the Theotokos herself. So very exciting opportunity. It is connected with the Christianities documentary, and Father Peter hears, and I'm going to be blessed to be joined by Buck Johnson. I believe David Erhan will be there, so it's going to be a fantastic trip. Again, not cheap, so if you support this kind of stuff, and I assure you there will be some great content coming out of it, be sure to get behind the paywall, worldwarnow.co. It really helps us out and makes more of these things possible. But be nice to Dimitri and GSP. Of course, he is going to be filling in. I know you guys always enjoy the show when he comes, so I'm not worried about it, but we're going to have some ether hours and some good World War Now episodes while I'm gone. The content train does not stop, and I'm going to be keeping everybody posted about my trip on social media, maybe vlogging a little bit. Let me know in the comments if you want to see some of that and what you would like to see from these places: Cyprus, Greece, Mount Athos, Metropolitan Neophytos, these types of people and things. What would you like to see? We have our Q&A thread up as well, so be sure to check that out on worldwarnow.co on the Substack, and you can ask any questions you want, especially about the trip. That would be fantastic to answer questions about geography, politics that have to do with that region. So looking forward to reading your questions. But moving a little bit away from Greece and everything there, we do have a few things in the church that we have to talk about specifically in Ukraine, and it's not all just persecution of the UOC. This is from Wallachian Gazette, which, brings us a lot of great news from Romania and Moldova, a great source. I'm going to read directly from them. It says, the Ukrainian government has denied the request made by the Romanian Orthodox Church, which tried to register itself with the Ukrainian Ministry of Religious Cults and open up a bishopric in Chernivtsi Oblast in the place of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which served the Romanian minority in Chernivtsi until the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Forces, with the help of national security forces, seized many of the churches belonging to the UOC. Ukraine has refused to right the wrong made by the USSR in 1944 when it kicked out the Romanian Church and forcefully confiscated and transferred the churches to the Russian-led UOC. To its credit, the UOC allowed the use of Romanian in its churches where a Romanian community lived. Kiev has decided to fully support the schismatic Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which firmly rejects the use of other languages and religious services other than Ukrainian. This is just another attempt done by Kiev to assimilate the Romanian minority in Ukraine by forcing the Romanians in Chernivtsi to pray in Ukrainian only. Step by step, Kiev eliminated Romanian from its schools, and now it has eliminated Romanian from its churches. Next up, the imprisonment of those that speak Romanian at home, following the Austro-Hungarian model seen in Transylvania more than a century ago. And of course, we know that the Hungarians of Transcarpathia in Ukraine were mass recruited to the front line and basically genocided. We know that they also supported the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And again, they're talking about the language stuff, which I'm sure is important. Ukraine is a fake country fundamentally made up of Russians, Hungarians, Romanians, and a few of these weird Polish, Lithuanian, Galicians who now speak Ukrainian. But that aside, the fact that this is happening shows that they're really enforcing the schism. And these Romanians, not only do they want to worship in Romanian, they want to worship canonically. They don't want to worship with a bunch of schismatics. The Patriarch of Romania does not recognize the OCU, and these Romanians that are Orthodox probably have no interest in getting along with Patriarch Bartholomew's neo-papist ecumenist project. So this is good to see, at least, that the Romanians that lived there were sticking to their guns with the UOC, but it's unfortunate that the OCU isn't. It's really foolish as well. You'd think they'd be nice to try to eventually get recognition from the Romanians and perhaps concede on this, but to them the whole fake Ukrainian nationalist project is far more important than orthodoxy or anything else. So nothing surprising there, but I know there is some other news going on between the UOC and the oppressive state in Kiev and Ukraine. Dimitri, if you have any updates on that.
Yeah, Zelensky, just amidst this Kursk incursion taking place, it's curious because there are at least, we can say more than half of the people in the current occupied zone, which amounts to, all these villages that Ukraine has captured in Kursk, 74 settlements, Zelensky announced just yesterday. This is, again, according to Ukrainian news. Russians have kept dead quiet after Gerasimov's mistake of announcing it was only 1,000 Ukrainians, right? Gerasimov will be essentially paying for his words, I'm sure, behind the scenes, but 74 settlements captured. The majority of these people, they are Orthodox Christians. There's a series of Orthodox churches currently occupied by Ukraine in the Kursk Oblast. Essentially, they're all placed on house arrest. The monastery in Sudzha, the St. Nicholas Monastery, that was set on fire and that the Ukrainians smashed a few explosive drones into for some reason, and even fired long-range, it seems like light artillery at it. A few buildings of that monastery have been lit up and essentially have burnt up and been destroyed and essentially cannot be used any longer. Fortunately, it is summer, so it's probably not going to rain and destroy most of that monastery any further in that place. But the persecution essentially is taking place in the war zone as well as in the so-called peaceful zone of Ukraine, when we know spiritual peace is really not achieved, wherein there is this massive onslaught of Ukrainian persecution. I say this because on one hand you have Zelensky announcing that the Ukrainians are preparing a humanitarian mission into the Kursk Oblast to save the Russian residents of Kursk from Russian oppression, right? And that probably means shipping people across into Ukraine, putting them in concentration camps of some sort. And we do know Ukrainian POW concentration camps strictly do not allow Orthodox Christian worship, Conrad, which is very, very important. So the Russian POWs who have been captured since the beginning of the SMO have been sitting in prison camps wherein you only have uniate chaplains. Maybe you have the occasional OCU schismatic priest, but in fact you cannot worship. There are no Ukrainian Orthodox Church canonical priests operating in these prison camps. So this is specifically, it's not just the warfare against the physical body, imprisoning someone, putting them in chains, putting them to work in a labor camp. It's also a war against the spirit, a war against the soul. So this is a very devilish type of tactic that we see used by the Ukrainian government. And Zelensky, as well as announcing that so-called humanitarian zone in the Kursk Oblast, he also announced that Ukraine will be working to enable and further enact its project of giving Ukraine spiritual freedom, which, again, what he means by that is further persecution of the UOC. And if you recall, 3 weeks ago, Poroshenko's statement in the Ukrainian parliament was that the Ukrainian deputies and members of parliament, members of the Verkhovna Rada, do need to begin voting very clearly for the ban of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because as we announced almost 6 months ago, the Ukraine essentially already had this bill enacted to ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but it simply hasn't been approved yet because for some reason the members of parliament haven't voted for it. And we spoke about our theories about this on previous episodes, that potentially there's a certain bargain happening behind the scenes, but Zelensky in this recent statement, I think he's most likely aligning himself with that Poroshenko, the other Jewish billionaire bloc, because Poroshenko's Jewish billionaire himself is probably a more has his own faction existing within the parliament who also wants to ban Orthodoxy. So you have various factions in Ukraine acting against the church. It's incredibly dangerous, and Metropolitan Onufri is stuck between a rock and a hard place because it doesn't appear that Russia, facing the troubles in Kursk, is looking to end the SMO anytime soon, and that means only longer and more prolonged period of persecution will ensue, and essentially the church will be negatively affected by this. Now, in terms of local actions being taken against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in the Kharkiv criminal court, an Archimandrite Matthew from Izium is going to be tried, and the Ukrainian prosecution will be charging him of, they're looking to give him 8 years of prison, allegedly when the Russian forces during the first month of the SMO took the city of Izium in the Donetsk Oblast. Archimandrite Matthew, who is the leader of the Holy Desert Monastery, a very small monastery in the Donetsk area, he allegedly stood up, and him and his monastic brothers actually, under his leadership, they allegedly supported the Russian troops, gave them food and water. So as you can see, that deserves 8 years of prison. So he's currently in Kharkiv imprisoned, and he'll be facing court, I believe, this week. So Archimandrite Matthew, keep him in your prayers. Definitely oppression is ever increasing. The other story, which is very striking, and it kind of goes into last week when we mentioned the various monasteries that Ukraine is looking to shut down around not just the Svetogorsk Lavra, but also some of the churches around the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra. In particular, this week it's been announced that the Life-Giving Stream Church located in the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra has completely been closed, and this is a church which locals have been visiting up until now. It's been completely open, and schismatics have frankly avoided it. It's quite an ancient church. It's been completely closed by the local Ukrainian Ministry of Culture. They've announced that it is now going to be turned into a museum and will be undergoing renovations, and they've closed it with a massive lock on the gates. Local people cannot essentially participate, cannot even pray for their own country, which is what essentially the church is for. So the Ukrainians, essentially, the regime is acting against itself here, and it's not looking promising in terms of the Ukrainian persecution to be put on hold. And I think Zelensky's statement recently, Conrad, has highlighted that the regime, now with its incursion into Kursk, has gained more steam and now is looking at these local successes as the green light in order to potentially push further against the so-called faith of the Russian world, as they call it, this Russian world heresy, which they want to exercise out of Ukrainian land, which in fact it is the Orthodox Christian Church which has existed in this particular area, long before the word Ukraine was even known. And this is why the Ukrainian regime is so oppressive to the local Russians and the Orthodox Church, because the church itself, through its saints, through its holy traditions, keeps this memory of a united Rus, a united Russia alive. And while that stands, the church is always going to be a target and essentially, a red sign in front of this massive Baal-shaped bull, which is the Ukrainian regime.
Completely agree, and the crazy thing is that despite the Ukrainians not getting permission from the United States to do their Kursk adventure, the U.S. has come out and said this Kursk operation fully falls within the realm of acceptable warfare and action. From the Ukrainian perspective, the use of our weapons is fully authorized in all of this. So major escalation that they just acceded to, that the Ukrainians, I guess, took for themselves. So in some capacity, the calculus was correct if they needed to do this to get, the U.S. to support them, taking a little bit farther than perhaps their NATO advisors would have advised them to do themselves. But regardless, the U.S. situation is getting negative, and as Kamala continues to gain in the polls and has completely equalized her betting market odds with Donald Trump, we see the second Groyper War has been launched by Nicholas J. Fuentes. It has been declared that he and his followers, which in some capacity we are part of that extended universe, we are supposed to not be supporting Trump until there is definitive action to, specifically fire advisors Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles, Trump's top campaign advisors, and they are never-Trumpers that have no interest in putting America first. They are pro-mass migration, pro-Israel, socially liberal, have no interest in putting the 2016 agenda that Trump ran on that won him the hearts and minds of the American people at, the top of their agenda. They're more interested in winning over Enriques and Jamals and alienating white Karens, as opposed to doing the strategies that will actually win them the election, which is securing white working class votes in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which is how you win the election. And if Kamala is going to do that better as a black Indian woman than Donald Trump, the white candidate, then they're going to lose. And it doesn't matter whether or not the platform is good or bad, because they're not even going to win to begin with. So the Groyper War is trying to get them to pivot and get them to make specific promises, explicitly an immigration moratorium and a pledge from Donald Trump to not go to war with Iran if he is elected, which I think are two, as Fuentes elucidated on his show, those are two moderate, reasonable, and popular demands supported by over 50% of Americans across the board. Most people want a dramatic reduction in immigration to the point where they would support net zero, and the vast majority of people do not support a war with Iran. The only contingent of people that even support Israel at any kind of large-scale capacity are very, very old Americans. And those people are not in charge anymore. It's not their country anymore. Frankly, if this was any other time in history, they'd all already be dead. So we can't keep having these boomers and silent generation people that love Israel dragging us into these foreign wars. And that, of course, applies to Ukraine as well. And if we want this stuff to end, I do think Donald Trump is still the best candidate. But not only will he not do what's best because his future administration will be staffed with neocons, but he probably won't even win if he keeps up with this nonsense campaign run, like I said, by LaCivita and Susie Wiles. So be sure to check out Nick's Rumble and Nick's Telegram and his Twitter to find out exactly what to do. He has people sending emails, acting on Twitter, doing all sorts of things, very optical and whatnot. So if you want to get involved in that, go check all of that out. We find it very interesting and are sharing all of that stuff as well. So the 2024 election, it's in full effect. Trump had his first Twitter space with Elon Musk recently, which crashed the site. They tried to claim it was DDoSed by Iranian bots, which I think is absurd, but regardless, that's the Jews trying to fearmonger against Iran once more. But it was a huge space, and many believe it will mark Trump's return to X/Twitter, which couldn't come any sooner. I don't think anybody really wants to be on Truth Social anymore, so it's time to get back on Twitter. It's time to kick this into high gear, and it's time to fire Las Vida and Wiles, talk about immigration moratoriums, anti-white hatred, and no more wars for Israel, which I think is a very good step in the right direction. And if Trump can align himself with that vision, I think a lot more people are going to be excited to vote for him. So unless you have any thoughts on that situation, Dimitri, World War III as a whole, I think we're ready to land this plane.
Yeah, just kind of, looking around the world at the moment, it's really tough looking at what's happening in America. Just Trump not being able to address domestic issues such as immigration, as well as his own campaign and like the people who run it. I think it's incredibly concerning. And what will it exactly say for his foreign policy? How sober, how correct-minded will he be? And, will he allow mistakes to take place similar to the ones which occurred during his previous presidency, which essentially enabled this entire Ukrainian conflict and the schism to take place. So just very concerning, I think, for Orthodox Christians that Trump is acting in this semi-senile type way where he's not noticing particular issues and, he's selecting certain people to be on his campaign. Incredibly concerning. But in terms of people being moved up the political chain, there's last sort of bit of news regarding Russia and the greater world war, and I think even the future of Russia potentially, given that Russia is still in this transitionary phase from its Russian Federation form into the future Russian Orthodox Empire, which we speak about quite a bit, which essentially has been prophesized by the saints. We do see Putin actually assigning, we did mention the KTO, the counter-terrorist operation taking place inside the Kursk Oblast. Putin has assigned a particular leader to lead this counter-terrorist operation, and he'll be in charge of the entire Kursk Oblast and that massive stretch of 500 kilometers across essentially between Donetsk, Lugansk, and the Belarusian border. And this is Bryansk, Belgorod, and Kursk. And the leader has been announced to be General Alexei Dumin. And remember, we called Dumin the potential successor to Vladimir Putin. Before Belousov was made the Minister of Defense, he was one of the runners-up for that position of the Minister of Defense. He is a man of military training. He used to be a governor as well, so he has that dual sort of administrative military skill. And from what we understand, he is quite right-wing, very conservative man, so he'll now be in charge of it. And he'll be working very closely with the head of the FSB to completely control. It's not Gerasimov who's in charge of this Kursk Oblast. It's directly Dumin, who his official position is advisor to the Russian president, essentially. So he's in this kind of gray area where Putin gives him these projects and assignments and Dumin can go carry them out. And perhaps this is a play and a way for Dumin to make a name for himself for, any future succession plans, right? And of course, Nicholas Patrushev, the former head of the FSB, is also closely involved. Putin's good friend from the FSB, KGB days, and the current head of the FSB. These are all FSB characters, very scary in terms of their sort of past and their potential current power that they hold within Russia itself. So Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, is also heavily involved in Kursk, and so we do have sort of a strong leadership in this counter-terrorist operation against Ukraine taking place. And we'll probably report on it next week in my episode of GSP as to exactly how this will develop going forward and if there'll be any more news updates about this current sort of hot front of the future world war, which I think it will develop in that particular direction, given that, Putin is holding strong at the moment, but proper succession plan will need to be enacted, I believe, especially since the Russian Federation, it seems, has not yet completely sobered up and has not yet completely recatechized itself to take on this very powerful duty of being the catechon, which Patriarch Kirill has called upon for it to be. And so moving forward, I think this is the stuff that we'll be looking out for. And as you know, this is what we essentially do here on World War Now. We look as much into the past as we speculatively look into the future, and also read the clairvoyant prophecies of the saints and try to see exactly what God has prepared for the Russian and the various other peoples around the world, and exactly how they can act towards those sort of plans and synchronize themselves with God's will.
I think that's a great place to end this. World War Now, we like to speak in the prophetic perfect tense, the tense in which we speak about things to come as if the prophecies that we are aware of have, already occurred, because that's what we have to prepare for, right? But with all of that, I want to thank everybody for listening to the very end. It means the world to us. Thank you so much for subscribing, those of you that have. And if you haven't, join them at worldwarnow.co. That's worldwarnow.substack.com. Both links work. If you want to subscribe, you'll get every episode in your inbox. And if you get behind that paywall, you'll get access to all 50 plus Ether Hours, which is our premium show. We talk about all sorts of things we can't talk about publicly on YouTube, historical narratives. We talk about saints that are some of our favorites. We talk about space, whether it's fake, all sorts of extremely interesting questions that I know people like to explore. So be sure to check that out. It supports the show. It allows us to do all of the things that we do here with our translations and research and everything else, and keep these weekly World War Now, World War III updates free for the public to bring them, the good words and the news of these prophecies. And again, I'm going on my trip to Cyprus and Mount Athos, which again was only really possible because of your support. So I want to thank you all for that. And I'm going to be keeping you all posted. So if you want to see all of that, be sure to follow us on X. That's World War Now _ and follow me at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at Ocanonist. He recently hit 100,000 subscribers. So congratulations on that, man. And be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel World War Now. I know if you are subscribed on the Substack, be sure to get over and subscribe on YouTube as well. Even if you're not going to watch them on there, just do it because it helps us out. We have a backup Rumble channel. That's World War Now. We have our Telegram. That's World War Now Telly. That's a great place to stay updated with the latest in World War III in real time. And with all of that, I want to thank you again for listening. I want to encourage you to leave a comment if you liked what you heard. I want to encourage you to get behind that paywall and ask a question in our upcoming Q&A. That thread is live, so ask us anything you want. We'd love to hear from you. And with all of that, again, thank you so much for the support. If you're a paid supporter, thank you a lot. And if you're not, just thank you for listening, and God bless. Enjoy the Feast of the Dormition, whether you're on the new or old calendar. Congratulations on completing the fast, or good luck on the fast. And with all of that, again, thank you so much for listening, and God bless.